too would like to acknowledge the fact that I'm on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam. I've wanted to be here for a very, 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 very long time because something like 40, maybe 5 years ago, my wife, Frances Morphy, before she became a linguist, was an embryo anthropologist of art and did her master's thesis on Northwest Coast collections in British museums. So I read very much about the Northwest Coast, but in its historic time rather than its present. But I was also very much aware, even at that time, of the very strong engagement that First Nations people were having with museums, and the very sort of long-term relationship that must have developed over those years. So I'm very, very privileged to be here. I'll keep moving between the text and then talking off the top of my head, possibly. I just want to make sure that I get the argument straight, which is why I'll be reading a little bit. And I actually worked in the British Museum at the time of their first and only other exhibition on Australian Aboriginal material culture, as it would have been then, in the 1970s, at the time of my first job as a research assistant at the British Museum on a project called the No Number Project, which was a project that registered unregistered objects in the British Museum. They didn't think there were very many at the start, but something like 10 years later they still hadn't finished the project. The history of museums cannot be separated from the history of European colonization, but museums are also connected to many other trajectories, but a particularly important, relatively autonomous one of globalization. Both historical processes have to be seen as trajectories of change in a world that's been transformed, and values have changed dramatically over that time. I've argued that museum collections are deeply entangled in value creation processes, and that indeed the use of an attitude towards museum collections is at times both in step and out of step of such processes. The outcomes of research, collection and exhibition is to change the value of things in the present and to add our understanding of the past. Changing how things are valued depends on the context and regime of value in which they're placed. Collections and archives provide a resource for understanding how the objects were valued at the time of collection, both by the source communities, the communities of origin, the communities that made the collections, the material, and by the collectors. The value creation processes in which they often changed their meaning and significance. They almost become different objects, yet they do not leave their past behind. Indeed, the ideology of museum, its best practice, is that the past is carried forward with the object, even the unpleasant past associated with the museum or the collector. The museum should retain the old labels, the catalogue entries should be added to, not overwritten, and the exhibitions and loans should be recorded, not always followed in practice. Time is a difficult concept to grasp, and anthropological discourse about time has engaged with its complexities. In analysing trajectories of technological change, seasonal cycle, system of exchange, kinship and bestowal, and even thinking reflexively about how anthropology may not position people in relation to past, present and future. Time is of particular relevance in understanding and engaging with collections in museums and archives. And in researching the past and engaging the past, it's important to understand that we're entering another time, not through a linear timeline in which the world is somehow moving in a coordinated way, but through a time that is a conjunction of different pasts and presents and different trajectories. The perspective from infinity, or at least the longue durée, means that museum objects are both of the present and yet in another sense have no place or time of their own. And the distinction I'm making between the source community and museum community is centered on two of those trajectories in which the same object can be placed, but both have histories of discontinuity and displacement. I'll illustrate this point with two. I better just quickly go back to this map. Okay, the two objects that I'm talking about, one comes from here, and the other comes from the very, very top of this map, just to the right of where 2 is, the area of Arnhem Land. This is a map of the Aboriginal languages of Australia, and the colonial process that I'm going to talk about began there, where you see 6, and it ended relatively late in 2, and it had very different histories of colonial impact in different regions of Australia. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is that that particular time of colonial, if you like, intrusion into people's lives had very significant effects in different places. And the two objects that I'm going to be talking about, one is a container and the other is a spear. The container in this case is made of kelp. It was made in Tasmania sometime before the 1860s, we're not sure when, and it is the only kelp basket to survive from the 19th century, and it's in the British Museum's collections. There was one in Paris, but it's been lost. This is probably the only Yolngu object also to survive from the 19th century in collections in museums. This was made sometime before the 1860s, but it would have been in some ways contemporaneous in many ways with the Tasmanian kelp basket. It was collected in Macassar in Sulawesi, and it was collected by a Danish collector of ethnographic material and so on and so forth, but botanist, a general sort of scientist of his time, probably of aristocratic heritage, and he collected it from the Raja, from his collection, together with other things. And it was in the British Museum labelled as possibly New Guinean for nearly all of its life, until, first of all, an anthropologist, Charles Mountford, in the 1950s said, this is not New Guinean, this is Australian. And then I looked at it and said, it's certainly Australian, but it also comes from northeast Arnhem Land, was almost certainly made by people that I work with today. So we'll talk about the different histories of these objects in different aspects. So the Yoyo Spear was made by people who at that period of time were still living beyond the colonial frontier. The first mission station in eastern Arnhem Land was not until 1935, and that mission station happened in part as a result of Yolngu resistance to the intrusions on their land by outsiders, by people who were from Japan, who were pearlers, collecting trepang, things like that, and by policemen from the south of Australia, European policemen from the south of Australia. And it was at the moment when the frontier had become too visible for people to engage almost at the moment in taking justice into their own hands, the Europeans, and sending in punitive expeditions. Indeed, the police suggested that they would send in a punitive expedition, and the government was informed that this was the plan and immediately told the police to keep out of the area. And they responded in a very interesting way. They sent in an anthropologist and missionaries on the edge. So we're dealing then here with something that was made nearly 100 years before colonization. So Yolngu view of their place in the world at that particular period of time would be fundamentally different from the view that indigenous Tasmanians have, the majority of whom would have been massacred by the early colonists. And Yolngu were trading with the people of eastern Indonesia and had been trading happily with people of eastern Indonesia probably for some 300-400 years. Indeed, this is a drawing, I can't remember who's it by, I'd like to say it's by Thomas Bock, but it's not, of McKessons in Darwin in the 1890s. And you can see that the McKessons would set up little temporary villages, usually in the same place, year after year, establish relations with the local community, work get Yolngu to work with them in the collection of tree-pang and its preparation and smoking. So, this is a European representation of the McKesson trade, and this is a Yolngu representation of the McKesson proud. And you can see details of things that are very relevant to Yolngu, if you like, almost ethnography of the McKessons. Yolngu have song cycles that are performed today, which will give detailed accounts of the life of the McKessons, both in Northern Australia when they came there, but also in their own land and also in the sea. You've got lots of bags of tree peg up there. You've got dugout canoes at the top there, and you've got McKesson knives, shears, and so on. So the history of in 1907, the McKessons stopped coming because the Australian government wasn't actually Australian government then. Australia wasn't quite federated, but the government actually of South Australia, the Northern Territory, imposed taxes on the McKessons, and suddenly overnight that particular relationship stopped. So the history of these two objects in the museum then is very different. The Tasmanian Kelp Basket was first exhibited in the Great Exhibition of 1851 to exemplify the use of kelp as a raw material for manufacture. In the British Museum in the 19th century, it would have been seen as a functional object made by a person from a hunter-gatherer society, even though that particular representation was only one of the representations. So the very fact that in the Great Exhibition it was shown as an innovative use of raw materials in the vast regions of the British Empire or ex-empire, it shows another interesting way in which that would have been framed. It was originally labelled as a pitcher, referring to its function as a water gatherer. Small in size, exquisite in appearance, it was labelled as a possible model. But on the other hand, it possibly wasn't a model. It possibly was used as a drinking vessel or something like that. So there's an enormous range of ways of interpreting this, and those ways, as we will see later on, have very much been explored by contemporary descendants in using this particular technology in contemporary contexts. Over the past 50 years, its growing significance is seen by the fact that it's appeared in all of those exhibitions that I referred to. So it was in the original 1970s exhibition curated by Brian Cranston for the opening of the Museum of Mankind in London. It was then exhibited in an exhibition curated by Lysant Bolton, who is now the keeper of the Museum for Oceania, Africa and the Americas. And the exhibition was called Baskets and Belonging, Indigenous Australian Histories. And in 2015 it took place in the temporary exhibition, Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilisation, that was followed in 2016 by the move back to Australia for a reciprocal exhibition, Encounters. Now the Yolngu Bati has a very different history that I've summarised already, so I won't go into that. In the sense, it's different history. It wasn't recognised as what it was, and it wasn't exhibited as anything until this exhibition here. Now, the title of the exhibition was deliberate. Unfortunate that it was sponsored by British Petroleum, which meant that most of the protests about the exhibition were almost entirely directed towards British Petroleum. But we felt that in the context of the British Museum, it was important to show the sense in which the British Museum, as a place of civilization, actually acknowledged the flatness of civilization, in a sense, as a concept. And it's obviously a fairly obvious idea in some ways, and yet it was an idea that was also in synergy with what Indigenous Australians were arguing for the Australian exhibition that followed, really. We want to show Australians that we're still here, that we are still producing, that we are in continuity. So we thought that that message was equally relevant in the context of Britain. And it was very much picked up by the Indigenous Australians who were involved in the exhibition. The Indigenous Australians were involved in the exhibition at all levels, but I suppose most significantly, the senior curator at the British Museum, Gay Sculthorpe, is a person of Tasmanian Aboriginal descent. So that was one of those particular links that we had. But the whole exhibition was part of a research project that was looking at ways in which you could link distributed collections in overseas museums, and using the United Kingdom as an example of that, and the source communities in Australia. So there was a group of representatives of the source communities, but we also, for all of the objects that were exhibited in the from the British Museum's collection, well, actually, the objects that were there, because we decided on the exhibition as the research project went along, were returned as images to the community and discussed, and people talked about how they might like to follow their knowledge of the existence of these objects up in relating to the museum. And it's an ongoing project. This, first of all, started something near 10 years ago. But we're in the middle of a major sort of follow-up, which is building on the research that we did at that time, and following, in some ways, the guidance of different communities in response to the kind of things that I'm actually talking about now, the way that they see the objects in relation to their past in present context, and the different ways in which they want engagement. So the history of the kelp water carrier and the Bati illustrate the value creation processes associated with museums and ethnographic collections and their entanglement with European history. Over time, the water carrier has become a symbol of the devastating consequences of colonization of Tasmania by British. Its uniqueness tells its own story. Precisely, it's the only one left. And the recent exhibitions that story has come to the fore. However, the value creation operates in many dimensions, and the inclusion of the kelp vessel on an exhibition, Baskets and Belonging, reflects a major change that's occurred over time, and very much in the last 40 years or so, in both the recognition of the value in material objects made by women and in challenging the neglect of art, of craft as a creative practice. So you can see that has had significant consequences in the context of the colonial societies or the post-colonial societies in both of those kind of areas. And I think in the case of craft and challenging the category, it's probably in many ways taken a leading role. I think the recognition of the richness of the technical, the sensitivities, the raw materials, the skills, the exquisite aesthetics of objects that had been categorized as craft in an environment that didn't have such a hard and fast division between fine arts and craft actually was really significant. It was very, very significant in Britain. I know it's been significant. And there have been echoes of it obviously happening since the end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century. And it was just coincidental that the parallel temporary exhibition was on Greek civilization. So we felt that it kind of made a point in many ways. By far the most popular exhibition was on Indigenous Australia. But, you know, I think I'm all in favour of Greek pottery as well. Now, this was the British Museum's exhibition. The British Museum exhibition, you're constrained by two things: relatively small space, and the fact that there's a tendency today, which I hope is going, to build exhibition spaces as circles. It's probably the worst conceivable shape for an exhibition space. The National Museum of Australia is built in its, I suppose, the most usable spaces as a circle. In the less usable places, it's an absolute warren of corridors. But in the case of the British Museum, okay, this was a circular environment, so we were challenged in some ways by that. And you can see here, just briefly, some of the kind of references to different objects, but also to colonial histories. I can't go into this in any detail at all, but the exhibition contained both contemporary works by Indigenous Australians as well as works from the early time of European colonization. And it also contained very much works of political significance. So this is not in the British Museum's collection. We borrowed it from the National Museum of Australia, but it is in the National Museum's collection. And it's one of the original posters, what would you call it, signs, from the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra, set up in the late 60s. So there was no doubt people coming to the exhibition were very aware of that context. Now, as I said, we had very, very strong involvement of Indigenous Australians. Some of the objects in the exhibition had sort of, if you like, good political histories. Some of them had nasty histories. This is a beautiful object of flaked glass spearhead from the Kimberley points that became very valuable trade items post-European colonization, but were valuable trade items at the edge of that period of time. Of course, they are objects that were made as colonists arrived with glass. There weren't the equivalent kind of material in Australia. There wasn't any obsidian or anything like that. So although people did make fairly fine spear points. They were in very different kind of materials. But this was collected by Constable Ord, after whom the Ord River in northern Australia is named, and the Ord River scheme, which is one of the world's great environmental disasters, and bringing, apparent wealth, but always the apparent wealth disappears because the crops fail in that part of northern Australia. But so that's not what I'm talking about now. Ord was one of the people who, in the 1870s and 80s, was pacifying the Aboriginal population of the Kimberley region. And indeed, some of the objects in the British Museum say, we collected these after we dispersed the people, and dispersal meanings shot them. So we didn't hide that history, and one wouldn't hide that history, but the person who was the chair of the Indigenous reference group for the exhibition, very heavily involved in it, a very, very distinguished Indigenous woman activist, June Oscar. Her response to the exhibition was as follows: "The British Museum's enduring civilization is a powerful step towards honouring our living history." She said, "Both older and present-day objects draw attention to the unsettled and emergent dialogue that is ever unfolding between our Indigenous nations' claim to self-determination and sovereignty, which we have never relinquished, and the Australian nation-state's imposed governmental and legislative authority over the entire continent," words that would be very familiar in the context of British Columbia. "It is our triumph that in the heart of London, with the seat of government that once upon a time threatened to demolish us just down the road, that our lives and heritages have come to be displayed through our equal consent and involvement." Now, the Encounters exhibition, held the following year at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, was curated independently, so we deliberately had, well, there was only one person, Ian Coates, who was involved in the curation of both exhibitions. And he, in a way, had to be. He's a very good curator, but something like 12 years ago, it was his idea to start these particular projects rolling. So he'd actually been working closely with the British Museum and the National Museum all that particular period of time. But he took a back seat in both of the exhibitions, but he was very much involved in the curatorium. Now, the theme of continuity remained central, as was engagement with the source communities. And during the consultation period that had taken place, objects had been commissioned to juxtapose with those from the British Museum's collection and some other collections. So there were objects from Cambridge, there were objects from the Pitt Rivers Museum, there were objects from Exeter. So there were some objects from other museums were involved in this. The pronged fish spear, garara, from illustrated drawings from the First Fleet, collected on Cook's Voyage, and indeed in the museum in Cambridge, were made by descendants from the region. One was made by Rod Mason, a Guyagal man, but other objects of innovative traditions that had developed post-colonization were also included from the Sydney region. There's an unbelievable tradition of making objects encrusted with shells. So the particular object there was an object representing Sydney Harbour Bridge by Esme Timbery, beautiful object. And if you actually start doing research into museum collections, you will find, and you have to actually look at fairly obscure museum collections very often, that tradition of making things encrusted with shells went way, way back, probably to the time or shortly after European colonization in that area. So making objects that then had been sort of classified really early on as tourist art, probably in the 18th century and things like that, 19th century, yeah, continued with that association until probably again 30 or 40 years ago, when suddenly people saw a very different value in the objects and also saw their importance as historical resources. The exhibition included commentaries from different communities, some in the form of text panels, others film statements that addressed the visitor directly and had a powerful impact. And some were quite scary, but others were very gentle. Indigenous Tasmanians have in recent years worked very closely with museum collections. This is a Kelp Basket by Vicky West, a Tasmanian Aboriginal person, that's encrusted with things that come from a particular kind of iris, so they're sort of leaves of a plant. Exquisitely beautiful objects. And people have developed creative continuity of practice with past technologies. And indeed, in Vicky West's panel, which I haven't got it here on the original Kelp Basket, she said, we've been making those for several years based on illustrations in books, drawings by French explorers in particular, done in the 18th century, end of the 18th century. Well, in fact, the real term was sort of about 1799 period. So, and we were able to learn from one, the British Museum, that we'd been making them slightly wrong, and we'd been making them in a way that they couldn't be used as a water vessel, because we'd been making them so that they were bound all the way around, and there was no way to pour the water out of it. And the one in the British Museum showed that, and then suddenly re-looking at these other things, they were able then to start extracting the function out of the object. And again, this is the really important thing, or one of the really important things about engagement with museum collections, is that you're engaging with objects depending on your perspective, your, whether you're a historian, an anthropologist, an aesthetician, or craft maker, maker of artworks, then you see them in completely different ways and then draw very different potentials out of the material there. And Tessa Atto, who's she's someone who specializes in shell necklaces, but also Tasmanian descent, said, I think a main point would be not to focus so much on the invasion and colonization, but to look back at what we had beforehand, what we still have, like the making of shell necklaces, the bracelets, the baskets, working with ricao, palawa work, the bush kelp. I think those things happened forever and still happening today. Now, a complementary exhibition, Unsettled, was held in the National Museum. And the focus of this exhibition comes from its title in many ways, though you'll find that some exhibits are more settled than others. This is very much unsettled. It's an installation by the Indigenous Tasmanian artist Julie Goff, and it's titled Timekeeper. The focal object was a vessel made from kelp, filled with sand, not water, and it had a hole at the bottom which the sand trickled through to form a conical pile on the floor. Goff explained that it's a statement about time spent apart between the carrier, the basket, its homeland, and its people and its intended purpose. The artwork was accompanied by a film she'd made on the beach where the kelp was sourced for as a vessel. And of her visit to the original water carrier in the British Museum storage facility, she concludes, I hope the homeland that the original water carrier hasn't heard for generations can be absorbed by it while in the National Museum of Australia, a bittersweet reunion. So in her visit to the British Museum, she conceptualized that this was so far away from home And as it moved closer to home, then she was making a statement about exactly that rupture in time. And there are many of the sort of contestation that is involved with different Indigenous perspectives on this are the different ways in which they engage with objects and the different values they see in the different places in which they're located today. So June Oscar really saw the very fact that this Ord's material was in London as being so important. And the consequence of that is that you can actually say, look what he did. Look at our wonderful culture. Why is this place called the Ord River today? So it's in a sense a very complex value and so there is actually room for completely opposed views about location between different members of the same Indigenous Australian community, which again is a globally familiar thing, I think, with all human societies. The Yolngu response to Bati was, the Bati being the spear, was a completely different. It, too, as I say, is likely it was the oldest surviving object. The person in the Encounters exhibition, Claude produced a historical commentary on it. Long time ago, when the northeast wind blew, the Makatara, that's the word for the McKesson people then, would travel from their place up north in Indonesia to Arnhem Land. They came in boats called prows. They planted tamarind trees and traded with us. The Aboriginal people, they traded the tree pang. And the Makatara traded knives and goods and materials and things like that. You all have this sense of continuity with the McKesson past that they do not share with non-Indigenous Australians. So non-Indigenous Australians, that was terra incognita, that part of the world, Australia. Of course they didn't have connections outside. It was unknown. They were unknown people in an unknown land. But of course, certainly they were not unknown people, and they were people who not only were known to themselves in their land, but known for hundreds, thousands of years to other human beings who they were interacting with and trading with and so on and so forth. And that's very much the kind of message. So Yolngu was so pleased. See, we told you we were always trading. There it is. Where did that come from? Is that our land? No. Isn't it great that it and those spears are ceremonial spears used in public ceremonies. Here we have a photograph of mine taken in the mid-1970s where the dancers using bati are dancing out the form of a sand sculpture in the shape of the hull of a McKesson prow. So the continuity of relations with the McKessons in Yolngu imagination, in Yolngu ritual, in the names that Yolngu people have, is incredibly strong. So it was, this was not a past object in any way at all. And it was actually fulfilling a function that they said, well, it's unproblematic. Of course we traded those kind of things. Yeah, we probably did one of those ceremonies, yes. And this is an opening of an exhibition that I curated with Yolngu for the opening of the National Museum of Australia in about 2004, so a long time ago. And they built a sand sculpture, and this is the ceremony they performed there for the opening of the sand sculpture, which they made in the night before the opening of the exhibition, so that it was there in its full glory, but nobody saw how it was made. So let's go on quite quickly. Now, the Yolngu work in the Unsettled Exhibition was completely different from the Tasmanian, from Julie Goff's kind of response. So in both cases, it was made by someone called Wooken Wannambi, who's a Yolngu artist who is also the curator of what's called the Mulka Centre, Knowledge Centre in the Yirrkala community. He may even have visited here. I think he did with Ishmael, yes. And Ishmael Marika's a Yolngu digital artist, filmmaker. So Yolngu are very much in continuity with the past, present, and they look in terms of their engagement in the future. And you can see from the rather, well, this is, okay, just to show, I better actually sort of read sort of what I was saying about this. So his installation was an exegesis on Larrick Each, which are sort of hollow log coffins and memorial posts. And it comprised a series of hollow trunks, some which are straight in form, and that's the form traditionally used for interment and for other things. So that's a traditional regular Juane post. And the objective was to show the process of making Larrick Each, but also the relationship of Larrick Each to the forest and the process of growth and decay in the environment. And the accompanying text is a reflection on Yolngu metaphysics almost. The outside surface of things hides what's inside. I want to share what is hidden. In Yolngu understanding, the life of the spirit is a circle. The Larrick Each is a circle. We're looking for our identity and we search around and around until we find our destiny, and we go straight to that circle and join it and become a part of the family. Now, in placing objects in their historical context, and I'll just go on to this, and I'm going to speed up. This is the one that was in Unsettled. And you can see the text is not the same as Julie Gough's. It's almost the opposite. My history is alive today. My history keeps on building up. My identity is stronger. It's not dying. The more I share, the stronger I get, the more power I get. So it's from a very different kind of space in relation to those kind of collections, because they're completely different history in many ways, and a different sense of continuity and discontinuity with collections that are in museums, and a different way in which those collections are now being rebuilt. But I say I don't want to overstress the differences in the present context. There are differences in the present context, and you'll see what those kind of differences are. But then there are also enormous both similarities in the present context and differences that Aboriginal people as a whole acknowledge are problematic and need to be addressed. The difference that needs to be addressed, I don't know if I've got this map next, I have. Okay. So Yolngu led the fight for land rights in Australia, and they in many ways were very successful. So the area that you can see to the sort of, where you see two, that whole area under two and to the right of two, to the left is Darwin, and it's not Aboriginal land anymore, but it does have areas of Aboriginal owned land within it. But the whole of that area is Aboriginal land. There are vast areas in the Northern Territory, and when it's Aboriginal land in fee title in Australian law, which is the strongest form of title that you can have in Australia. And as a result of the Blue Mud Bay native title trade that I was involved in, 80% of the intertidal zone, that's the sort of water between the low and high tide mark, that is Aboriginal owned. And there are massive cases to work out how on earth that is now going to be compatible with all sorts of other Australian laws that exist in relation to rights in sea and so forth. But to get that kind of rights is very important. But in areas like Tasmania, in areas of most of New South Wales, areas of most of Western Australia, there is not that kind of land rights legislation, partly because the land rights legislation varies on the basis of stake, but also because the land rights, has been, in a sense, destroyed through subsequent legal action by colonizers. So there are these really different kinds of problems which are reflected on the kinds of agendas that people have, and yet at another level there's a very strong sense of unity across Indigenous Australia, that we have to accept those kind of historical kind of differences, and somehow we're going to have to work for ways in which we can address the other kind of inequities, collaboratively. Another way in which, in a sense, people are very much the same, but in different ways, is in the engagement with museums. So in the case of Indigenous Tasmanians, they are really engaging with museums as venues, as places where their art and material culture is going to, from now on, be located. They're engaging with museums as a historical resource. And in fact, the Indigenous engagement with museum collections is in many ways transformative, because many of them have a very personal kind of interest in research and engagement and so on. So, and of course, there are many Indigenous Australians now involved in the curatorial of museums. Not enough, but significant numbers. So I think the point that I'm making, so I better sort of round it up now, is that while the historical circumstances of Indigenous Australians differed, from the 1960s onwards, the recognition of rights became a common struggle that united them across the continent. From a shared present, Indigenous Australians do encounter different and relatively autonomous space-times from the past when entering collections and archives, and have to connect them with different, though overlapping, trajectories into the present. The collections themselves can seem fundamentally different resources, both in terms of scale, emotional timbre, and potential resource, and priorities engaging with them are going to vary hugely regionally. But it is important that in the present time, difference is recognized in a collaborative environment in which cultural institutions can both work with that difference and across it. And because I see I'm running out of time, I should end in about a minute. I might say briefly what are the implications of what I'm saying. And in a sense, what I'm saying can be summarized by a concluding chapter, heading, within a chapter anyway, of a book that I'm just finishing, that I've had a sort of discussion with Gay Sculthorpe in the British Museum over the particular subheading, to get a kind of connotation of things that are going to be a little bit more specific, but also in some ways more open than tropes like the museum must be decolonized, which is something that has come up again and again in recent years, and has very much been taken up by government. And there's now in Australia beginning to quite a strong critique of the way that government has taken that up, as in a sense an option that if you're not careful, oh good, decolonize, right, it's your problem, have it, which is the last thing that people actually want, because it interrupts that process of engagement and the real need for resources and time in these processes. So, I mean, the heading here, or the subheading, may change when the book gets published, is recognition, access, engagement, and return. So, I mean, the most important things of those is that they are dealing with a process, and a process that actually, if it's properly engaged with, and people think of what the implications are going to be of those things, recognition has to be first and foremost. It's got to be fundamental. And that process of recognition in Australia comes from an era which the Australian anthropologists referred to as the Great Australian Silence, when Indigenous Australia didn't appear in any history books. The great books on Australian art published until the 1980s, the general books, or 1990s, didn't mention Aboriginal art. Aboriginal people were invisible. A very distinguished prehistorian, John Mulvaney, had to admit, I mean, he was a wonderful human being, and in his life had very close and transforming relationships with Indigenous Australians as far as Australian archaeology was concerned. But when he was first of all a young archaeologist in the just after the Second World War in Victoria, he said, I suddenly realised I didn't know that I'd ever met an Indigenous Australian when he was working in there. So the invisibility at all kinds of levels was completely extraordinary. Not invisible to themselves, but invisible actually to the state, because the state had no, in a sense, even policies in those kinds of areas. So recognition is of such fundamental importance. Then I think something that everybody who works in museums understands is access. And access requires actually, first of all, knowing where collections are and what's in them. I think MOA is doing an extremely good job. It's one of, it has a strong reputation for being a pioneer in this era of making its collections known and linking in with communities to add value and documentation and so on and so forth to those. Museums in Australia are a long way behind at the moment, perhaps because most of them were general museums of, but not. Anyway, so that's incredibly important. Engagement. Well, I mean, again, I didn't say very much more about that. And then return. Return means very different kinds of things. I think return, we were discussing it, it's a very useful word. Repatriation is a difficult word, partly because it's a word that's often used falsely in the sense of, now we talk about digital repatriation. And what does digital repatriation mean? Well, it's actually creating images of objects and then returning those images to communities. So that, and it's very much what many communities want and have as a kind of priority. Certainly Yolngu really want to have photographs and copies of photographs, not of just of the material objects. In fact, material objects are probably the last thing they want photographs of. They want photographs of relatives from the past. They want photographs of the communities as it was. They want photographs for all of those particular kinds of reasons to engage them. But also in the sense of return, many say in the south of East Australia, but I mean, Yolngu are not concerned with return, but where is return to in communities that are themselves part of internal diaspora? The majority, vast majority of Indigenous Australians will live in Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or Brisbane. The vast majority of centres of Indigenous art practice for those areas there are in those regions. Very different in north of Australia, very different in places like Arab and the Torres Straits, very different in many ways, but nonetheless, people from the Torres Strait Islands are very much part of a diaspora that goes right the way across Australia. So when one's thinking about return, if you link that to the ideas really of recognition, of agency, of getting involvement, of creating the kind of resources that enable communities themselves to be establishing means of connection and the time to do this. And that's why the problem with just a simple idea of repatriation is that it doesn't look at what happens afterwards. It doesn't look at, you've actually shifted a problem in some ways. And so I think we're moving into a period of time where people are beginning, in particular museums and many Indigenous communities, to be working on the same page in relation to the fact that the resources need to be done in order to work those particular kinds of things in place. So I'll finish at that point. Okay.